All right, thank you and welcome to today's event, Perspectives on a Trade War.
Changes by the moment.
That's right. It does change by the moment. We figured, everything these days has to have a little search engine optimization, so we had to get trade war in the title there somehow, and China. It was an interesting...
China, not China.
That's right. For those of you new to the American Security Project, just a brief introduction. We are a nonpartisan national security think tank, approaching 15 years old, 14 years old, I think. We were started by a bipartisan group of senators and former senators. Kerry, Hagel, Hart, and Rudman joined our board, and they asked us to look at national security from a long-term, fact-based perspective. Our board includes a number of retired senior admirals and generals, national security leaders from both sides. We try to keep a national security perspective on everything we do. And that's everything from, today we're talking about trade, to more traditional national security issues like war and peace in the Middle East and all these sorts of things, to energy security, climate change, nuclear nonproliferation, public diplomacy, all these sorts of things. I should note too, today is going to be our last event here in this space. We're moving down to 1201 Pennsylvania on June 1st, so update your address books and everything. We're excited about it, and they also have a great event space there. We'll be hosting plenty of events there, so look for our emails there. In today's event, we're going to talk about perspectives on a trade war. Kind of what's the background between the U.S. and China trade relationship, what's the current status, and what are the prospects from the future. I'm going to quickly kind of lay out a baseline on what ASP believes on this, and then I'm going to hand it over to our speakers who have much more detail and knowledge and awareness on this than I do. But basically, what ASP thinks and believes is that trade builds peace and security. There's clear evidence, for example, that I think a lack of conflict in East Asia since 1979. There hasn't been an interstate war in East Asia since the Chinese, Vietnamese border wars there. So that lack of war is linked to increased trade, both within the region and globally. There's also clear evidence that countries that grow from trade are less likely to go to war. Now, this doesn't hold for countries that grow from exporting resources. It grows from countries that invest and grow from trade and openness. So for these reasons, at its base, we believe a free and open trading system, which the U.S. created and led for over 70 years, is a good thing. But one of the things that we'll be exploring today is what happens when a country takes advantage of that system. So I think it's clear that China has tested this throughout its economic rise. It has been, ironically, both a supporter of a liberal open trading system without a liberal open economy. So does that mean, I think maybe it's gotten away with it for so long because it's so big and so crucial to so many businesses and so crucial to other big geopolitical issues that maybe it hasn't been challenged for a long time. Now, ASP, we worry about tariffs and trade wars. They're both bad economics, and I think they're worse geopolitics. You can't ask for action in other areas when you're harming a country's economy. And certainly with tensions in the South China Sea, North Korea issues, and a litany of other geopolitical issues in East Asia, it's really quite important. That's the baseline. That's where we're starting from. With that, I'm going to get out of our way. Our two speakers today, I'll briefly introduce them. Ivan Schlager is going to be our first speaker. He's head of Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom's CFIUS practice, represents a diverse group of clients ranging from defense companies, major telecom providers, and media and tech companies. Before joining Skadden, Ivan served as Democratic Chief Counsel and Staff Director to the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. He really is one of the leading, if not the leading, CFIUS lawyer in the country.
I wrote a statute. I didn't think it was going to pay for my children's education, but it worked out okay.
There you go. Carolyn Bartholomew is Vice Chairman of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. She's worked at senior levels in the U.S. Congress, serving as counsel, legislative director, and chief of staff to now House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi. She was a professional staff member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and also served as a legislative assistant to then U.S. Representative Bill Richardson. In addition to U.S.-China relations, her areas of expertise include terrorism, trade, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, human rights, U.S. foreign assistance programs, and international environmental issues. I think you should come work for us. She's a consultant to nonprofit organizations and also serves on the board of directors of the Kaiser Aluminum Corporation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ivan. He's going to give remarks for as long as he wants, and then we'll have, and then then Carolyn can talk for a while, and then we'll have some discussion and hopefully open it out to the audience here.
Well, I appreciate being here and really delighted to be at ASP. I've been following the work over the years. General Cheney does a terrific job and brings something to the table that's so desperately needed right now in our discourse, which is bipartisanship. So
we try to.
It's great to be here. As I was thinking about this topic, I was thinking about the great Obama line in the debate with Romney. The 1980s called and they want their policy back. Well, the 1980s have called and they want their trade policy back.
Right.
I started to get into this and was involved in drafting Ex Florio, which was part of the Trade and Competitiveness Act in 1988. So a number of our Chinese clients that we deal with, or when we're in transactions on the other side of the Chinese, they're absolutely convinced that this is some measure that was drafted to address China. And this was something that was part of a comprehensive trade strategy that included, and Bob Lighthizer is adopting this today, using 301 unilaterally to crack markets open like the Japanese market, creating Sematech, creating an institution that was going to help preserve a critical component of our defense industrial base. And then, almost as an afterthought, the Commerce Committee's amendment to the Trade Act of '88, the Ex Florio Amendment, which was designed to look at the implications regarding foreign investment that could potentially threaten or impair our defense industrial base. And it's evolved over the years from looking at what we considered targeting by Japan, keeping their domestic market closed, and then using the relative openness of the US market to acquire skills and technology. It evolved from focused on Japan, focused on European aerospace and defense companies, many of whom were state-owned and had a slight competitive advantage and access to capital, to where we are today, which is, focused on the competitive impacts related to China, who is operating under, I would say, you mentioned earlier, a rules-based system. They're operating under a different set of rules. They have a different economic structure, some of which mirrors our system, and some of which is where they've taken a page out of the Japanese playbook of working hand in glove between government and industry to target certain sectors. Like if you look at the China 2025 plan, they have sectors that they clearly targeted, and then through their investment policy, trying to go and acquire skills. Mm-hmm. And so a number of the problems that we face, very similar to what we were trying to address in the 80s. I think the biggest, from my perspective, the single biggest difference is, back in the 80s, in the tail end of the Cold War, you had Russia was a strategic competitor, but not an economic competitor. Mm-hmm. Japan was an economic competitor, not a strategic competitor. And you have with China this turbocharged economy that's also a strategic competitor. And what I think the Congress is struggling with today is how do you update our system, our rules that cover foreign investment, to address both a strategic and economic competitor who may be using subsidized capital to target certain industries, to gain skills and technology that they may not be able to develop themselves. And so, people ask me, well, what's the investment environment like now in the United States? And I said, well, if I have to use one phrase, it would be challenging and unpredictable. Mm-hmm. Because right now, 2 years ago, I could predict how, if you were to do an investment in the U.S., what the threat risks and vulnerabilities were, the asset that you were going to acquire, the threats and the risks associated with the acquirer, and then how the administration, and in the world that I deal with, CFIUS, now here's something that's really interesting. You have an 11-agency group that operates on consensus. Mm-hmm. And what could possibly go wrong? But we used to be able to predict with some precision and certainty how both the economic agencies and the security agencies would line up. I think the biggest single change today is there's no daylight between the economic agencies and the security agencies as far as an open investment in climate and the need to protect national security. So there's a long-winded discourse to go from the 80s to today, but many of the challenges we were trying to address we're trying to address today as far as new technologies like artificial intelligence, autonomous driving, geonomics, and there are whole series of industry, and even back to this basic microelectronics, where the risks associated are not dissimilar, but the consequences are fairly large.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Thank you,
Over
Andrew.
to you, Carolyn. Yeah.
Thank you, and it's in some ways a relief for me to have somebody who's so steeped in CFIUS on here so he can answer all of the CFIUS questions that might come up. First, actually, I'm really glad that we got here into this building because I had not been in to see what they had done with the old Greyhound bus station. Right. And it was it's very interesting. For those of you who might not, who are young and might not even know, it used to be the Greyhound bus station downstairs. Yeah. Andrew, I just want to add, certainly I believe in the importance of free and open trade, but I think that we have to add fair as a necessity into that equation. And one of the reasons that we are where we are is because we have had a system of free and open trade, and China has not had a system of free and open trade. And you have to put fairness into the equation. And I went and looked. Our deficit, although I recognize that some people don't think that deficit numbers matter, our trade deficit with China since it joined the WTO, so from 2002 to 2017, cumulatively is $4.2 trillion. If you take a look at that's in goods, but if you take a look in goods and services are supposed to be one of the areas of the economy where we really provide a lot of value, the deficit still cumulative over that period is $4 trillion. So it's not a huge difference between just merchandise goods and trade in goods and services. And while deficits don't indicate everything, they definitely indicate here that there's an imbalance in the relationship. I think it's really important, while I respect the looking back at the 1980s, I think the important takeaway from all of that is the value of a comprehensive trade strategy. I am always concerned when I hear people liken China to Japan, because I think that the issue certainly that Ivan mentioned about we are now facing a strategic competitor that's also an economic competitor is critically important. The fact that scale, the sheer size of China and its economy differentiates it from Japan, and also the nature of the Chinese government. I think that when we look at a different set of rules, China is playing by a different set of rules. One of the mistakes that has been made over the course of the past 30 years in our trade negotiations is that we have somehow gone into them thinking that China wants the same thing that we do and views the world in the same way that we do. And I think, again, if there's any lesson we need to have learned through all of this, it's that is not the case. They have a different view. The Chinese government is completely transparent in what it intends to do, and that's another thing that I would say that we have messed up over the years. They're not hiding what they intend to do. I mean, they put out a series of 5-year plans. It's the 13th 5-year plan now, where they outline the economic steps, the sectors of their economy that they're intending to focus on. Ivan mentioned Made in China 2025, the whole concept of indigenous innovation and what the Chinese are trying to do. I mean, they're transparent. They say what it is they're going to do. I can't fault them for what they do. They are building their economy the way that they do. I don't think that we have been particularly effective to date in addressing the challenges that they have come up with. And I'll put in a pitch for the China Commission, which our wonderful staff put out a paper in March on China's techno-nationalism toolbox. And I just want to quickly run through the list of the policy tools that China has used as it has been building its own economy and has been shutting us and other countries out of it. They use localization targets. They provide state funding for industry development. They provide a lot of government R&D funding. They have restrictions on government procurement. They focus on technology standards. They have not exactly a transparent regulatory process. That they do foreign investment restrictions and import guidance. They are trying to recruit and seeking successfully to recruit foreign talent. They are acquiring foreign technology, both through acquisitions and also through industrial espionage. So they have a lot of tools in the toolbox that they use that have raised concerns, which I think why we are where we are on the CFIUS debate too, which is, I know one of the issues that comes up is about joint ventures, that a lot of times what the Chinese government will do is what it can't do directly, it will do indirectly. So it's established investment funds that are trying to do some acquisitions that are of serious concern. I'd also say that I think that the Chinese have been ahead of us in always seeing and acting that economic security and national security are intertwined. We have had a tendency in this country to separate the two, that economic security is one thing and national security, which is seen in kind of a traditional military security, is another thing. And the Chinese have seen those two issues intertwined, and I think that we have reached a stage where now we are seeing. I mean, it's just not possible to be militarily strong if you're economically weak. When you talk about issues relating to the defense industrial base, that's it there specifically. And again, even the defense industrial base, our whole defense base is not just what it used to be. It is not just people making steel, making aluminum, making tanks, making bullets. This whole realm of innovation, which is the future of our economy, is very connected. Artificial intelligence, if you think about how the military is using artificial intelligence, how the Chinese government wants to use artificial intelligence. Look at robotics, look at nanotechnology, special technologies. All of those issues are both economic issues, but they are also national security issues. And we need to pay attention to them, and that's really the challenge. So again, I would say that I think the Chinese government has been very transparent about what they're doing. They have a centralized economy. We still have allergic reactions in this country when we talk about industrial policy, and
I totally agree with that. But I think what's interesting, how many people use Siri?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't.
Okay. So you guys know that Siri was developed by DARPA.
Right. Right.
right? So if you look at most of the innovations that were in, and what I find interesting about this debate is, well, we're, oh my God, China's got an industrial policy in China 2025, and I'm fairly familiar with that. You know, a lot of the innovations that we enjoy today came out of when we used to have an industrial policy.
Right, right.
And I grew up in Southern California where, you know, from Redondo Beach and Hawthorne all the way to the airport to UCLA was an industrial policy that was really centered on it. Anybody watch DirecTV? You know, which you can thank the Defense Department for DirecTV and the satellite programs, DirecTV. So I think, you know, we went through this process where, oh, government has no roles in innovation and technology, and that's all coming out of Silicon Valley. But we kind of forget our own history, which was both a, you know, from national defense scholarships to the National Research Lab at Xerox PARC in Palo Alto. Many of the things the Chinese are doing are basically copying what we did in the late 50s and the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s. You know, that being said, then I think there is a legitimate role for us to, A, have a national strategy on technology, but B, figure out, you know, are there instances, and this is kind of what we do, are there instances where Chinese investment presents an opportunity for us? I'll give you one example. We did a transaction in the printed circuit board space. Really the last remaining printed circuit board manufacturer of any consequence in the United States. And they did a acquisition in Asia, Hong Kong-based entity, where the Hong Kong-based entity ended up owning a fairly sizable minority position in the company. But it ended up enabling them to become a more robust supplier for the aerospace and defense market, because they sell printed circuit boards to Apple, who hammers them on cost, and they service that out of Asia. They have 6 plants now in the US devoted to printed circuit boards that go into the F-35, and having that ability to shift cost and do high volume manufacturing in Asia and then do specialty manufacturing and higher margin actually benefited both the US economy but the defense industrial base. So, you know, there's always a little bit of nuance in this issue.
Yes, we'll jump right into going back and forth then, which is, I mean, it is interesting to me that you mention how military technology in this country has led to civilian innovation, or I mean, these things that we use. I think, frankly, we need to continue to invest in our military technology, R&D, and I see some declining investment in certain sectors about that. But I think also when it comes to China, we have to be thinking about how civilian technology is being used for military uses. Yep. So it goes both ways. It's not the, I'll use the word benign use of Siri, though the news that has come out about Siri and Alexa and the fact that people can hack into it. I think it was Kellyanne Conway who said your microwave can spy on you. I mean, in effect, it can. Which
certainly your smart television.
Yeah, your smart television. Mine turns itself on and off by itself sometimes and has to be unplugged to stop doing that. So there are all of those issues. And again, I mean, Ivan, I would ask, so these printed circuit boards that are being used in the U.S. defense industry, how has China's defense industry benefited from also having access to that technology, and both how they have benefited directly, but what they might be learning about how we use ours.
So I'll do a self-promoting plug. And I think that's really one of the benefits of having a robust CFIUS process and an export control regime that probably needs to be updated for this century. You know, what we were able to do in that situation was create a secured subsidiary where there was no technology transfer from the U.S. to China. So the China factories had no technology transfer.
Right.
And then create a governance structure around that with cleared individuals who receive a counterintelligence brief every 6 months. So, plus they're protected by the ITAR and export control regime. And I think that's where people who structure these transactions, if you do it the right way, and the first thing that we do when we look at a transaction is what's potential technology transfer. And I think this is what the Congress is trying to solve in the new CFIUS legislation. How do we ensure that we don't do exactly what you're saying? It's transfer technology that gives the Chinese an ability to leapfrog where we are now, either through a joint venture or through an outright acquisition. How do we structure something with protections in place that enable us to take the benefit of foreign investment, foreign capital coming in, while leveraging the opportunity to either expand a market in Asia or expand a distribution network in Asia? So it's look, I don't think it's not straightforward. I think people who look at this as only one way, it's like, oh, we should have an open investment regime when the Chinese require that you license your technology and you can only own 49% of a Chinese entity. I don't think that's fair either. I mean, we really do need to have some balance here.
Right.
And I'm going to go back to my opening remarks, which is it should be part of a comprehensive strategy. I mean, it was an omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act. It wasn't just reforming the trade laws. It was investing in Semitech. It was investing in, there were scholarships, there were worker retraining programs, and there was a foreign investment regime. And I think that comprehensive approach is probably where we should be headed today.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you.
Do we see any movement towards that from people in the administration or in Congress, or is this just something that we're going to continue to do piecemeal here and there?
Well,
what do you think?
I was going to say,
Carolyn.
I agree that a comprehensive strategy is critical. I mean, these are complex issues, and you don't solve complex issues with one simple solution. Mm-hmm. That said, I don't think the absence of a consensus on a comprehensive strategy should stop the individual pieces from moving forward, because otherwise we're going to be waiting. I mean, can we do a comprehensive anything right now?
Well,
in this Congress
right.
and in this political climate. I mean,
we're going to build a comprehensive strategy. It's going to be beautiful.
Right. Well, and I mean, we Andrew and I, we were just talking briefly before it started that, I mean, I agree that I think that our trade negotiators now are trying to have a strategic, comprehensive approach to what they're trying to do. And with one tweet, the man at the top can throw the whole thing in disarray, and it has in fact done so. So it's a very difficult dynamic.
And the irony of that tweet is, as bizarre as it was, and I have to say, a little interesting. Having spent a number of years trying to understand the security risks related to Huawei and ZTE.
Right.
It is also complex because the number of U.S. semiconductor companies that sell to ZTE, the number of European operators who have ZTE equipment, and what are the consequences for interconnecting. And yet, I mean, the behavior that Commerce was lashing out at ZTE is a very important national security issue.
Yep.
And that was, I thought, what was strange. It was like the almost cavalier nature of not understanding that, these companies can be used for offensive and aggressive purposes, not just in the United States, but more importantly, outside the United States.
Right.
And I think that it does raise questions again, both about the fact that it's been an identified intelligence threat, but also about commitment to rule of law. I mean, it was about sanctions at the same time that essentially the administration has made a decision that could be punishing companies, I'm talking about Iran, but punishing companies of U.S. allies. And so it's baffling for any,
Because we're not shy about imposing major fines and penalties on European companies for violating the OFAC regime.
Right.
There are several French banks that bear the scars of that. I mean, this is even more significant because of the telecommunications equipment space is so fundamental to national security.
Right.
And
so embedded in our lives. I mean,
in our lives.
We think of,
yeah.
again, microwaves, but Alexa and Siri and Fitbits and all of these.
I was
and such an
involved in the
important-
Alcatel-Lucent transaction, 2006, and the Nokia
Yeah.
subsequent Nokia transaction. When you think about 50% of the U.S. switch network were Lucent switches, and if you have the source code to that switch, you have an ability to engage. No question the Chinese engage in industrial espionage. There's no question that they are aggressive on cyber. Look, some of our allies are aggressive on cyber.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also a key part of, you talk about for our national security, but for the Chinese government, a key part of their own internal security is the ability to be able to monitor telecommunications and communications networks and everything like that. So it's a very important thing, and I think there's still a lot more of that ZTE story to come out. We don't know. We'll see how that plays out and what's next on that. One question I have for each of you is why now? Why is this all of this coming to a head now? Is this just simply a case of, I think there was an Axios story a couple of months ago that the president said, "Where are my tariffs? I want my tariffs." Is this just simply, everybody, all the staff in the White House looking for any leverage they can get that could move towards a tariff in any way? I tend to think on the steel tariffs that may be what the background is, but
Look,
on the 301 tariffs and everything, why is this something that's coming up now? Why is CFIUS reform happening now? Is it just, built up over the years?
I think, look, it's been building for a number of years. I think if you look at the last year of the Obama administration, the PCAST report on semiconductors is a good example of Chinese targeting the microelectronics industry and what are the security implications. And then the DIUX report, tail end of the Obama administration, what are the implications of Chinese investment, either minority investors or early stage investors in technology? How did he win the election?
We're still trying to answer that.
No, but Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, areas that have been impacted by what is considered to be, inequitable trade policies. I think this has been it's been building for a number of years. And then the other thing that I find interesting is the frustration, particularly the U.S. tech community, with gaining access to China.
Well, so I want to take us up, just broaden this just a little bit and say, first, I completely agree that it has been. I've been doing U.S.-China issues since June 4th, 1989, Tiananmen Square, changed the path of my life in terms of the policies that I've been working on, and starting back in the 1990s when people started raising concerns about Chinese practices. I remember the machinists did a report, I don't know, maybe 93 or 94, Jobs on the Wing, about forced transfer of production of Boeing airplanes from Wichita, Kansas, over to China. So, I mean, people were seeing some of this going on, and I think that politically, the fact that communities in this country have suffered, a lot of people in sheer industries are gone. Footwear is gone. Textiles are gone. Steel is gone in a lot of places, and I think that we have, as a society, failed the people. People can say, well, these people all need to be prepared to work in the economy of the future, but not everybody is going to be a coder or a programmer, and we have not done enough for job retraining and creating new opportunities in green energy, for example. I'll put in one of your things. But I also have seen the debate on U.S.-China issues shift over the course of probably the past 10 years. And part of what I think we're missing in the bigger U.S.-China issue is what are our strategic interests in this relationship? Because we have seen so many decisions be made that have benefited one industry or one sector and another, I mean, every time the Chinese used to send a delegation over during the MFN debates in the 1990s, all of a sudden there would be sales of Boeing airplanes or promises of, purchases of Boeing airplanes. And then Boeing would be trying to make sure that nothing complicated, but nothing damaged the U.S.-China relationship.
Right.
So there were other issues that were not raised. And I think probably starting about 8 or 10 years ago, the business community started recognizing that they were not seeing the returns that they were that they expected.
Absolutely agree with that.
So all of these issues about not having access, having their IP stolen, and it puts the companies in a very difficult position. They can't speak out publicly, identifying themselves, because there will be blowback and they'll lose the benefits they have, or they'll lose market access. But there have been growing concerns, and we have seen those. And I think that also helped to fuel sort of why now, which is that a lot of the advocates for what I would call an unfettered U.S.-China relationship have not exactly seen the returns that they were expecting.
Right. Well, why don't we open it up for questions from the audience? So we'll have a microphone going around. I'd ask that you identify yourself before you ask, and phrase your questions in the form of a question, not a statement. Sir, right here. We'll start with you.
Herb Rose. One of the issues that has bothered me for some years, and it continues to go on unabated, it seems, is the theft of intellectual property and infringement of intellectual property. The TPP was supposed to resolve, that was one of a number of issues that was supposed to be resolved by that. Wouldn't we have now be in a better situation had we not pulled out of that agreement?
Well, I'll jump in and say, so TPP, China wasn't a part of it. It was in many ways aimed at setting the rules instead of China. I personally think we would have been much better had we been part of TPP, because then we could have been part of a whole block to be negotiating these instead of unilaterally trying to do it. But anything to add on TPP? And
Look, I think the multilateral trading system has, for the most part, served the national interest very well.
Yeah.
But it's also a legacy of, we built a system in which we made the system sustaining concessions to keep the system going. And when you were dealing with Japan or Europe or maintaining an alliance, I think that was important. On balance, TPP and tightening the rules around intellectual property protection, some market access, on balance, probably positive. But the elephant in the room is the Chinese have a different perspective on intellectual property. And and if you're a U.S. tech company and you want access to the China market, the cost of admission is licensing your technology.
So I think that TPP was not, sort of the failure of TPP or the collapse of it legislatively was not just a reflection of concerns about TPP. I think it also had to carry the water for what people had seen as problems with NAFTA and some of the other trade agreements. So I think it was a victim of its time and place. It is interesting, I just want to speak specifically on IP theft, that one of the only successful examples we saw of Chinese progress on IP protection was in the early 1990s. I think it was when Carla Hills put out a target list of Chinese products that were going to be sanctioned or not going to, if the Chinese government did not start doing something cracking down on intellectual property theft. And actually, there was some progress that was made then. So that was interesting to me. It was an example of you just go out there and you say, we're not going to put up with this, we're going to do something about it, and there was a response. It's interesting as we look at the WTO and China's entry into the WTO, that the WTO, there were questions at the time about whether the WTO was going to change China or China was going to change the WTO. And I would say that the answer, frankly, there is both. I mean, the WTO was intended to be a dispute resolution mechanism. The Chinese have now turned it into a situation where if you file a dispute there, it's a hostile act, which is not how it was before. So I think that there are a lot of things that need to be done. I'm going to question a little bit, Ivan, that the Chinese have a different perspective on intellectual property. You know, for the longest time, again, in the 1990s, so I'm not going back to the 80s, but to the 90s. And you know, in the 2000s, we were told, well, the Chinese will be better on IP once they have their own IP that they need to be protecting, and they have been filing a lot of patents.
Right.
So I'm not convinced it's a different perspective as much as they realized they could cut down on R&D costs and get access to technology that they wanted.
I was trying to be nice by saying a different perspective. What I really meant is they don't share the same Western appreciation for patent protection and rule of law.
Except the question is, well, they don't for sure on rule of law. The question is, well, whether they will start indeed seeing value to patent protection as they have more patents to protect themselves. And inside of China, we're seeing some of that. But
To me, I think the interesting question is, put the patent and IP protection in. There are people who make a very good living doing IP litigation in this country, and there are big Korea versus U.S., U.S. versus U.S. I mean, IP disputes are part of doing business.
Right.
I think standard-setting bodies, so if you look at the development of 5G and how the Chinese will play in standard-setting bodies, and do Huawei, put ZTE aside, does Huawei drive a 5G standard? And what are the security implications for that? I think it's something that we ought to be paying attention to. I mean, the IP disputes are going to be there. It is very difficult to do business in China. It's very difficult to protect IP. You have to be constantly vigilant. But I think this standard-setting body, and to the extent that Huawei has done things like use the China Development Bank to wire most of Africa,
right.
and then create allies within the global standard-setting bodies because they have a Huawei communications system. I think that's something that, from a national security perspective, we need to be cognizant
So
of.
what's at stake there? Can you explain that a little bit further? How does that? So they set the standard for 5G, and then.
Well, I mean, the implications, when you already think about how much sort of everything we do is tied to communications now, everything we do in our daily lives, the implications when you think about this move to have smart cities, for example, the water, the transportation system, the infrastructure of cities and how they run is supposed to be facilitated by 5G.
Right.
And I don't know how comfortable I am that a Chinese company would be
Right.
providing the
Sure.
telecommunications
Sure. So
infrastructure
could have
that provides the water or
provide
the electricity.
backdoor access.
The backdoor access, yeah.
Or something like that.
And there's another issue that you mentioned, but that I think we also need to keep in mind too, which is the access of Chinese companies to the deep pockets of the Chinese government.
Yeah.
And so they can, Huawei, for example, when some small town in Colorado is putting out an RFP for being wired, American companies that would be able to do that don't have the competitive advantage that the Chinese companies do that have access. So they can underbid, and they are doing that. And
They're ruthless on pricing.
yes, they're ruthless on pricing.
They're not great on service.
You know what?
Yeah.
If you are a small town governor
I-
in the Midwest or in the West or anywhere, and you have got to answer to your constituents,
Yeah.
you go with the cheapest.
If you're a
the
poor
cheapest.
nation in the Middle East or Africa, you go with
Absolutely.
the cheapest. I think,
Absolutely.
we do have to focus on one thing. I've been whacking Huawei today, but on innovation, their gear used to be knockoff. Their gear used to be, not as high quality. They are now high quality and
Right.
very innovative and cheap,
Right.
which is
It's a
a
hard
competitive
thing to
threat
beat.
to the Western.
But how much of their innovation has been because of the access to the Chinese policies that have, I mean, again, telecommunications is one of the identified sectors of the Chinese government, and they throw all of these benefits at,
Rand did a
cheap
report.
land.
Yeah. Rand did a report in 2005, and they talked about the digital triangle between the Chinese government and Chinese industry. I think that holds true today. I think where some of the Chinese companies get in trouble here in the U.S., I like to tell people in China, don't tell the U.S. government the story you think they want to hear. You're better off just telling them the story. The notion that Mr. Ren didn't serve in the signal intelligence group in China, all of a sudden, they said, well, no, he's just a civil engineer. Well, for the other state-owned enterprises, they all came out of the same unit. And it's not dissimilar. Like Israel, a lot of the tech innovation all comes out of the 8200 unit in the IDF. Same thing in China, but Chinese can't bring themselves to say, yeah, there's this symbiotic relationship.
Right. I saw a question back here, and then we'll go there and then here.
So my question is, Paul Wang, reporter from the Epoch Times, United States. The question is to do with, so last year, President Trump blocked the Chinese attempt to purchase Lattice Semiconductor. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but some Chinese publications just a few days, they boasted about, well, you blocked that, but now that we have actually acquired the same technology from purchasing South Korean and Chinese companies, well, not directly, but they basically use a lot of money to hire people from Taiwan and South Korea, and their publications are saying that they have achieved the same breakthrough as if as if they had purchased the Lattice. I mean, where does this end? Like, even if the United States blocks sales like the Lattice, the Chinese, they go to South Korea, they go to Taiwan, they go to United Kingdom. How do we prevent those?
I think you raise a really critical point. So from the U.S.-European perspective, we're seeing increasing cooperation between the EU and EU member countries in the U.S. on national security reviews. So there was a German semiconductor transaction involving a Chinese entity where there were U.S. assets, and the U.S. security community went to the Germans, and together they blocked the transaction. I do a lot of French in U.S. national security reviews, very similar with shared interest in trying to block Chinese acquisitions of certain technology. I think Asia, and Taiwan in particular, is very difficult. But look, FPGA technology that Lattice had, right, it's something that's been identified as a weakness in China. There's only one small company that knows how to do FPGAs. And I think as part of the industrial plan, Chinese are very creative and very persistent. And yeah, you've pointed out a weakness in the system. So there are Taiwanese and South Korean manufacturers, or even some Japanese manufacturers, where you can access that technology.
I think you point out a really significant thing, which is this increased cooperation, too, between the U.S., the EU, and the EU member countries on these issues, because the Chinese government has been very good over the years at sort of doing dividing and conquering. For example, again, I go back to the 1990s and the MFN debates. They would threaten to buy Airbus planes instead of Boeing airplanes, and all of a sudden people would fall in line. And so it is important and significant that cooperation is happening. Right. I think particularly in, Taiwan is in a very difficult position, but they are reliant on U.S. security, and I think that it needs to be communicated to them, the concerns that are being raised about some of these transfer of technologies.
Yeah.
Eva Hampel, U.S. Council for International Business. We're a trade association, so I have a question from the business perspective about the intersection between economic and national security that was addressed in the beginning. Yep. Something that has really come out through the discussions around FIRMA, the CFIUS legislation, of course, and from business perspective, the concern has been this discussion that's occasionally snuck in about economic protectionism, which sometimes from certain points of view seems to be used interchangeably with economic security. I just wanted to hear your view on that, of where you see the dangers of that to the U.S. economy as opposed to ensuring our ability to be able to be competitive in the global marketplace.
So I don't think that we're in danger of declaring yogurt national security issue, like my colleagues in France.
For them, it might be.
Yeah. Look, for the most part, CFIUS over the years has done a good job identifying legitimate and real national security threats. And people focus a lot on transactions that are blocked, but they don't focus a lot on transactions that are approved with the appropriate structure to protect national security that enables the U.S. to maintain an open investment climate. And I think that's my criticism of CFIUS and my criticism of some of the legislation is there's not enough triage to really focus on legitimate national security concerns. I mean, the most difficult transactions that I have done, some of them have been French and Israeli and not Chinese. Right? I mean, the Alcatel-Lucent transaction involving Bell Labs, the innovation in Bell Labs, the criticality of Lucent switches to our network, some past French behavior. I mean, the French are very good at helping their industry in a way that the U.S. government may not appreciate.
Or do itself.
Or do itself, yeah. I mean, we don't.
Industrial espionage.
See, I was trying to
You
come
were
up
being
with
nice
a
about that,
trying to
too.
come up for
It's good that I'll be here and
yeah.
just say the things.
But we're able to create structures in place, source code escrow and visitation policies and creation of separate subsidiaries to really welcome and enable that investment. Now, China presents this unique problem because at the end of the day, well, the French and the Israelis are allies. And there are structures that we have adopted over the years. I mean, I've done Italian state-owned entities, French state-owned entities, Israeli companies with connections to the 8200. But they're all allies, and there's a baseline of trust. And the problem I think this administration is having is, do you have entities in China that you can trust to comply with national security agreements? And Russia as well. I mean, we did Russian investment in the U.S. 4 years ago that I can guarantee you today those transactions wouldn't be approved.
Yeah. No, and I mean, it's, again, you sort of get to the nature of the Chinese government and what we think their longer-term intentions are. I mean, President Xi has made no bones about talking about the rise of China and the China dream and sort of moving again into a more Marxist orientation, at least in what they say, if not what they do. I think, Ava, though, I mean, you really put your finger on sort of what the whole issue here and why we were asked to come here, which is sort of an open market system versus protectionism. And I think that we have got to thread the needle somewhere in between. The Chinese government itself is enormously protectionist. It is running an economy where massive sectors are protected. And so, I don't know how we balance the way that we believe things should work with the way that they are doing things, which again I think answers why we are where we are today. That we haven't done it very successfully to this point.
I just think it's far more nuanced than we either have open trade or
protectionism. Yeah.
Right. And the president is often given a lot of latitude in national security issues. So there's too often, I think, a temptation to just label anything as national security.
I mean, can you guys tell that I was a protege of Bob Lighthizer?
The use of these inflammatory terms on me.
No, but I mean, I'm going to defend Bob, and because I think that what you are seeing is somebody who is a very astute trade lawyer and an astute negotiator. And I negotiate for a living, I guess, and one of the things that I've noticed is that when you really want to get a deal, your leverage is gone. And there's a famous story about Bob when he was deputy USTR in the Japan steel negotiations, and he was handed a term sheet that was translated. It was supposed to reflect the understanding that they had just come to, and of course the term sheet was completely different than the understanding. And Bob, as the agreement's being explained to him, starts folding it, and folds it into a paper airplane and flies it across the table and walks out. And in Japan, he's been known as the missile man ever since. But they ended up going back to the table and getting, a pretty decent agreement. And I think that one of the things, for too long, trade negotiation was a stepchild to some larger geopolitical issues. And now and where I started today, you see this melding between the national security community and the economic agencies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we need consistency.
Yeah.
And that is something that Bob is trying, but some of it is out of his control.
Yeah. I think last question here, and then we'll.
No.
Leah from VOA. President Trump tweeted that China and the United States are working well on trade, and he says it will all work out. It's the Chinese delegation headed by the Vice Premier Liu He is in town right now talking with the U.S. side about the trade issues. I'm just wondering if the panelists can talk a little bit about what might come out of it.
Like crystal ball.
Yeah. I don't know if I can say.
If follow-up question, I'm also wondering, we talked about this ZTE treat by President Trump. I wonder if you have any theories about what prompted that change of heart, what kind of, people are suspecting that China might have made some major concessions. What could that be?
Anything I say would be speculation.
Yeah, at this point, I think there's so much speculation I've seen and everything. It's, we hope it all goes well, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think the president does value his relationship with Xi.
Yeah.
And, one thing that I've witnessed over the years, they used to say all politics is local, but all politics is personal. Various people sitting in various jobs change how an agency operates. And I think the personal relationship between, go back to the Obama administration, I think the personal relationship between Merkel and Obama had a major impact on policy. Yeah. So I can't tell you how it's good.
I don't think, and the motivations, there's a lot of speculation out there. That the president likes to do deals and might not be as aware of the specifics of the specific, all of the issues that go along with the specific issues. So I don't think we know. I was interested last night to see somebody saying that the market was responding favorably, that there wasn't going to be a trade war. And I thought, man, the market is really hitching on a tweet, and I don't think any of us know what's going to happen and what's driving it right now.
Well, thank you all, and thanks to our panelists, Carolyn and Ivan, and thanks for you all for coming, and join me in a round of applause. Thank you. This will all be posted on our website, americansecurityproject.org, and you can learn more about all of our work there, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook and all the rest. Thank you.